Okay, good afternoon, Professor. I hope everything is going well. Today I'm talking about train spotting, basically the first part from page 1 to page 161. Train spotting by Irving Welsh. We will start talking about the biography of the author. He was born in 1958. He is still alive, and he published in 1993 his novel Train Spotting. The novel is set in late Edinburgh during the Thatcher era and its aftermath. The Thatcher era, we need to know that it was this political period in Scotland in which, well, not just Scotland, but UK in general, in which Margaret Thatcher basically just proposed some severe politics in terms of the privatization of the state, a free market, and basically just the separation between the state and the economic section of the UK. That obviously affected several areas. Some people profited from it, others were affected by it. And the novel basically just considers that, and it focuses on the working class youth, which was the one that was mostly affected by several issues such as unemployment, social exclusion, drug addiction. Let's not forget that during this period, heroin consumption was on the rise as well, and urban decay, which everything connects and creates this novel, which is a representation of that addict, which basically just symbolizes that working class youth that was affected by some of these decisions. Then we have a general overview of the novel. So basically, the novel follows a group of heroin users. We have several characters, such as Mark Renton, which kind of works as the main character. We have Sick Boy, Spud, Tommy, and Begbie. And we have other contributions, let's say, such as the baby that we're going to discuss later on. But something important to consider about train spotting is that it is beyond addiction, and it is not just an isolated personal problem. It is not just about, oh, these people get into drugs and they have been abusing them. No, it is just a way to present an entire social environment of marginalization, and basically just to present it from within, right? From the quote unquote addicts in this case. Okay. So, continuing with the overview, this first part basically just considers the introduction to the main character, Renton, and the city of Edinburgh. Some of the attempts of Renton to get heroin, well, his attempts to trying to leave heroin, getting heroin, being drugged again. It introduces the grip as well. We have cases of everyday deviance and crime, basically those cases in which they have to get drugs, in which they use them, cases of violence, like we will see in Begbie's case. Then we have Tommy's inclusion in the group, and like the space that I'd say marks the most this first part is Baby Done, and that's like the main events, let's say, from part one. And the theory we had covered so far at the moment we were supposed to talk about this was basically part one and part two of Foucault's Crime and Punishment, the abnormal classes, and Bakhtin's work on Rabelais and his world. So considering that, I like to discuss some ideas. The first one is the representation of the abnormal. We have, let's say, so far three sections that we can discuss. First, the drug addict is a figure that is really present, and we can identify through the use of heroin addiction, through that social rejection that they receive, those criminal behaviors that they have to perform in order to just get their drugs, use them, and that physical deterioration, which is highly linked to the representations they have throughout the novel in terms of their bodies. Okay, so this figure of the abnormal, well, the drug addict is a figure of the abnormal that is taking place in the novel that is actually showing that other side of the coin of what happened during this period of the Thatcher era, right? That some people profited from it, others basically were just left without any help, and some of them got into drug abuse. And we have the drug addict as that big, let's say, symbol image that is actually representing that. Okay. Then we have violent subjects. We have violence within the novel, which is in the, we can identify it in the case of Begbie, right? In which we have extreme aggression, a huge lack of empathy, a constant threat of violence, and like almost like a sense of a psychopathy, right? In that case, um, well, we couldn't omit violence in a novel like this one, right? That violence that is, put on these characters, that those scenes of violence that we can see it as two parts of the same phase, right? One could be like the kind of life they got into now, right? As outcasts, as abnormal bodies, and as these marginalized people, violence kind of became like part of that place, like a kind of language, like a kind of way to interact that is not controlled, or that is not prevented or even punished by um, by institutions. And we can also see like this is like I consider it like that, like an implicit way to present that violence that the drug addict suffers from society in general as well. Then we have the social outcast, right? That could be included within the drug addict, which is basically like the unemployed person, the poor person that does not produce anything, that is quote unquote a waste of life within society, which now is way worse because it is drug dependent and is outside the respectable society. And not just regular respectable society, but middle class society. So there's this, I noticed like this interesting kind of interplay between, okay, we are presenting these addicts, these social outcasts, right? That do not, cannot be considered into what middle class society considers um, as something positive, as something respectable, but is power itself, institutions themselves that are actually defining first what middle society should be, what is respectable within that middle class society, and are defining as well what is not acceptable. In this case, the addict. So there's this interesting interplay of power just exerting that, you know, not control, but formation of the whole system. And something that I noticed that the author does not represent these abnormal abnormality, like in this case, as a medical case study or as a monster, but basically just he presents like the daily life, the like the interactions, like the way these addicts, these abnormals, interact, like the way they behave, basically just like their own experiences. Then we have grotesque bodies following Bakhtin's work. Well, we know that the body is really symbolic. It represents many of these features that we have covered throughout the course. And in the case of the novel, we know that the representation of those bodies tends to be really excessive. Like it is most of the time connected to drug abuse, to excretion, like the scene of the toilet, like the toilet scene, right? Of course, birth, death, which in that case the baby Dawn, takes a huge relevance. So we have this inclusion of grotesque bodies throughout the novel. We have them in the descriptions, in the acts they take part of, and obviously baby Dawn, right? We can consider that the novel considers like vomit, feces, blood, disease, addiction, bodily decay. It becomes really descriptive, like in the case when Renton is getting his heroin ready, like when he's staring at the spoon, boiling it, reflecting and thinking about it. So we could say that grotesque bodies are highly implemented in this case. And we have the scene of the dead baby, of baby Dawn, which is highly symbolic. Well, this baby, like part of the plot includes like this baby like the gestation of that baby, the moment of birth, and that connection between, everybody being drugged, the baby there, his death, and all of that becomes really symbolic in terms of what Bakhtin proposes. That in this case of grotesque bodies, we usually have that connection between birth and death, and that it can be represented by, in this case, a baby, right? In that case, a baby that we can consider it as that formation. I can I consider it like that formation, like that gestation of that abnormal and grotesque baby that is like a formation of its surroundings, right? Of their surroundings, and how that grotesque, that sense of being grotesque, like kind of embodies that baby, and it's born, and surprisingly now it's dead as well, right? It couldn't even live for a while, right? Considering I connected it to this whole notion that everything that is grotesque is born dead in our society by our institutions that define what is acceptable and unacceptable, what is respectable and what is not. That sense of, let's say, that fruit of the grotesque, right, is already death within our society. That is just a thought that I came up with when I was reading the whole scene and trying to connect that with Bakhtin. And we continue with the theory. Now, talking a little bit more about Foucault, okay? Well, all these labeling is included within the reading in a way that, we are talking not directly about addicts, but we have like the whole setting of drug addiction, right? Now, language becomes really important in those cases because we see that the way they treat themselves kind of implies that sense of loneliness, I'd say. Like when they call themselves, like in terms of their sexuality, like in a demeaning sexuality way of referring to each other. Same thing as drug abusers, slurs, insults, all of that. And something interesting is that the novel itself considers a lot of um, let's say, language from the street or day-to-day language from low classes. It basically works through that, right? The way they communicate, the way they express themselves is not like this usual language that we find in novels, like let's say Victorian novels like that, okay? But it is like a language that is connected to that sense of being grotesque, that is represented through the bodies of these characters as well, right? So, well, we have all these labeling, we have all this sense of considering them as outcasts. We don't have like that interpretation. I'd say we don't have like an external source that is actually inferring that they are like medically ill, but mostly like they are just um like they're doing their drugs, committing crimes, not like justification or like any discussion in terms of that. And well, we can interpret how power like works through, like modern power works through. We have that Foucault basically just explains that ideally there will be this sense of surveillance that that institutions will be able to promote within society, and society will normalize a certain kind of behaviors, a certain kind of, let's say, expected citizen, and that through that interplay, correction is going to be reinforced like that. Okay, and in this case, following that idea, I'd say that we have like the other side of the coin, right? Basically, a representation of what couldn't be like adapted to it, and what was left outside, right? Something interesting that I always consider in terms of these Foucault's ideas is that sense of, yes, normality. Normality basically just defines and basically just sets the rules. But I think that even, and this is just like a personal thought, right? I think that even within marginal groups, there is like reinterpretation, like a new sense of normality within those groups, right? Within marginalized groups, there's like a way in which power still operates, and that people defines themselves as well, but defines themselves as a counter reaction to the power that defined them as unacceptable. Okay, so they become like a self critique. Well, not like a critique, but like a self attack to what matter power is not accepting. Okay, so the addict fails to become that normal citizen, but the addict it himself develops that like kind of culture of I'm an addict. This is what is expected from me. They create something interesting from the novel is that they have like this community, like that, like this sense of community between you know, the the characters. So yes, they are not stable workers. They are not productive people. They are not family people. But still, they embody like that rejection of that. Since they are what it is unacceptable, and society define them as the words of the words, the things that people shouldn't be doing, they still become that, right? They are not like exempt or free of what society is dictating. They are just like the negative side of what power is actually defining, right? So they become a rejection of middle class values, but they are part of those middle class values, right? That's a whole point that I want to develop there, right? And as conclusion, I believe that Welsh presents abnormality not as an expectation to society, but as one of its products, right? So this abnormality is still part and necessary for that system to keep working, to keep going, right? And the culture of the abnormal, the day to day of the abnormal is still kind of defined by what society and what power itself is basically just dictating. And that leads to the questions. We have question 1. Bakhtin views the grotesque body as a challenge to official culture and social order. Do the degraded bodies in Trainspotting function as forms of resistance, or do they ultimately reinforce the characters' marginalization? Kind of related to what I was discussing, right? And the second question, does Trainspotting criticize addiction itself, or does it primarily criticize the society surrounding addiction? And that's my presentation. Thank you so much, Professor, and I'll be sending it anytime soon. Thank you.